If it's true that justification is by faith alone, apart from works of the law, how do you live this out? How do you endure till that happens? How do you serve in such a way as to make God look great and not you? How do you live by the faith that you were justified by?
How do you live by the faith you're justified by? That's the question John Piper answers in this episode of Light and Truth. This sermon was originally preached at a 2002 ministry gathering in Venezuela.
Now, to the one who works, his wages are not reckoned according to grace, but according to debt. That's a literal translation. If you work for God, if you try to get fixed by working for God, even on the mission field, you will not have grace. You will have debt. You say, okay, pay me wages, God, because I'm working for you, and you'll get wages. And the wages from God are one thing, death. The only good thing you can get from God is a gift. If you want wages, you die. If you want a gift, you can have it, if you believe Him for it. Which is why He goes on in verse 5 of chapter 4. To the one who does not work, but, here's the alternative, trusts Him who justifies the ungodly, his faith is counted as righteousness. That's why I say, and that's why the Protestant Reformation has always said, justified by faith alone, apart from works of the law. In fact, chapter 3, verse 28 said that. Chapter 3, verse 28, we hold that one is justified by faith apart from works of the law. You cannot improve your standing with God by works of the law, because Christ is your standing with God. When you trust Jesus, you're united to Jesus, and Jesus' righteousness becomes your righteousness, and your sin becomes His sin. 2 verses to show that. 5:19. Romans 5:19. As by one man's disobedience the many were made sinners, so by one man's obedience the many will be made righteous. One man's obedience constitutes your righteousness. Jesus. Two things by way of application here. John Bunyan, at about age 25, who wrote Pilgrim's Progress, was walking one day distressed and torn with lack of assurance that he was saved in the woods. And God brought to his mind 1 Corinthians 1:30. Christ is your righteousness. And the way he put it to himself was, my righteousness cannot be any better or worse than it is now, because my righteousness is in heaven, where Christ is. Christ is my righteousness. God beholds Christ, and in Christ sees me, and He sees His Son perfectly having obeyed the law. And therefore I have fulfilled the whole law as I'm united to Jesus by faith alone. That's a warfare against the devil that will work. All the devil's accusations will fall before that claim. Here's one other application, and you're missionary, so I mentioned this one. Now, there's a lot to be said for contextualization, etc., and some things not to be said for contextualization. When I preached through Romans 5 several years ago, it hit me like a ton of bricks that Adam is the father of every person in every people group in every culture in the world. And the main problem to be solved for every person everywhere in the world as the child of Adam is the sin of Adam. That's chapter 5. Let's just go back to 5:19. For as by one man, that's Adam, and you can go to any people group in Venezuela, Siberia, Thailand, any country in Africa, any Muslim people group, any Hindu people group, any Buddhist people group, any animist people group, and this verse is absolutely true of them. Namely, they are the children of Adam, and according to verse 19, as by one man's disobedience, the many were made sinners. Chapter 5, verses 1 to 12 are written to solve the problem of my original sin. You don't have to understand this. You better believe it. Every place you go, people are sinners because they are the heirs of Adam. Adam sinned, and in Adam we all fell. That's got to be fixed, or we all die. The way it's fixed is with a second Adam, Jesus Christ. And as by one man's disobedience many were constituted sinners, by one man's obedience many are constituted righteous. And you know what you lose if you lose original sin? You lose justification. Because justification in Romans 5 is built on the analogy of how did I become a sinner in Adam? His sin was imputed to me because I was corporately in Him. How then do I become righteous in Christ? His righteousness imputed to me because I am incorporated into Christ. If you lose original sin, you break the parallel and you lose the glory of justification by faith alone. Your righteousness is not your behavior. Your righteousness is Christ's behavior. And it was perfect righteousness. And when you get into one of those dark seasons, say, I have fallen, and there is a cloud over my life, and God in His fatherly indignation, because He has removed all wrath from me that is punitive, is now punishing, no, let us use the word, disciplining me. When I fall, I will rise. The one who has the darkness over me will execute justice for me because I am in Christ and He is my righteousness. I don't know any other way to get out of the dark than that. This is a precious, precious doctrine. If it's true that justification is by faith alone, apart from works of the law, how do you live this out? How do you endure till that happens? How do you serve in such a way as to make God look great and not you? How do you live by the faith that you were justified by? Or put it like this, how do you get sanctified? That's the other biblical word that is the process of becoming like Jesus. By faith. Because I don't want to start working for God. But now right here, there's a lot of misunderstanding. So maybe I can spend the rest of my time trying to help you see what it is to live by the same faith that you were justified by. Let's put it like this. I warn you, CRM, not to serve God. Why do I say it that way? Why do I put it in that offensive, provocative, controversial, unbiblical, or is it, way? Acts 17:25. God is not served by human hands as though He needed anything. For from Him and through Him and to Him are all things. He gives all men life and breath and everything. God is not served by human hands as though He needed anything. Acts 17:25. Or take another verse. The incarnation. Jesus said in, Mark 10:45, the Son of Man came not to be served. Just stop right there. The Son of Man came not to be served. Therefore, I feel warranted by the Bible to say, CRM, don't serve Jesus. He said He didn't come to be served. Acts 17:25 says, God is not served by human hands as though He needed anything. He came not to be served, but to serve and give his life a ransom for many. I call what I'm against, that so many Christians have fallen into, I call it the debtor's ethic. Or if you're a baby boomer, you could call it the Tonto ethic. Raise your hand if you've ever heard of the Lone Ranger. Well, the Lone Ranger, 45 years ago, was on television. And he had an Indian sidekick named Tonto. And there was one episode where the origin of the relationship between the Lone Ranger and Tonto was explained. And it had to do with the Indian culture. One time, this Indian Tonto as a boy was in trouble, and the Lone Ranger saved his life. In that culture, if somebody saves your life, you bond yourself to them and serve them the rest of your life and get them out of all kinds of scrapes. So every issue, every show on television for who knows how many years was all about the Lone Ranger with his silver bullet and his white horse doing justice and getting himself into a pickle, and Tonto getting him out of the pickle. That's every show. That's the way a lot of people blaspheming live their Christian life. God saved me. I will now unite myself to him and serve him and work for him the rest of my days. Now, they never quite say get him out of pickles, but they say things like, He gave his life for me. What have you given for him? I call it the debtor's ethic, and I want to warn you against it and tell you why. Because it's not the way to live out justification by faith. There are 3 reasons why I want you to forsake the debtor's ethic. The alternative to the debtor's ethic is what I've tried to call living by faith in future grace. I have a big, fat, 400-page book called The Purifying Power of Living by Faith in Future Grace. And that's what I want to explain in these last few minutes. Because I think if you can catch on to what it means to live by faith in future grace, you will be the happiest mission in the world and very fruitful. 3 reasons why not to embrace the debtor's ethic, which says, God gave this to me, I better work hard for God now and try to pay him back, the debtor's ethic. Number 1, given the reality of future grace, the debtor's ethic is impossible. Let me explain. What I mean by future grace is God didn't just give you grace in the cross. He bought with the cross all future experiences of grace. And by future, I mean 5 seconds from now and 5 million years from now. You will live totally by grace 5 seconds from now. If you breathe, it's grace. If your heart beats, it's grace. If you can think without going crazy, it's grace. If you still believe in 5 minutes, it's grace. That's what I call future grace. Grace to live by, grace to die by, grace to escape hell from, grace to have eternity. It's all grace, and it's future from this point on. And now 4 seconds of that future grace is past grace. Grace is like a river flowing to me from God from the future. It crashes over the waterfall of my present. It accumulates in a reservoir of the past. And I stand here on this waterfall looking back to get encouragement for how much grace He's shown me, especially in the cross. But I live my life this way. And every step I take in you. Jesus. Every step is grace. Now, if that's true, the debtor's ethic is impossible. Because if you take a step on the basis of grace and you're drawing down more grace for that step, if you take another step into a hard place and do a hard thing by grace, leaning on grace, you're not paying anything back. You're going deeper into debt. Every minute of your life, you're going deeper into debt if you live by grace. The whole mindset of, I've had grace shown to me, I got to pay something back now, is so flawed, it's an offense to God. Now, let me put a Bible verse or 2 under that. Let's say 1 Corinthians 15:10. 1 Corinthians 15:10 says, by the grace of God, I am what I am. And his grace toward me was not in vain, but I worked harder than any of them. Starts to sound like the debtor's ethic. I worked harder than any of them because he showed me grace. And then he adds, nevertheless, it is not I, but the grace of God which is with me. It means every step I take in grace, which means I go deeper into debt, which is where I want to be for the rest of eternity. In debt to grace. Oh, I don't ever want to pay this back. I don't ever want to be on a tit-for-tat relationship with God that says, okay, I've paid my mortgage, now we're equal. You get from me, I get from you, we exchange. God forbid that anybody would ever go there. So first reason why you can't live the debtor's ethic is because it's impossible if you understand future grace. Or take another verse before I give you another reason. 2 Corinthians 9:8 says, God is able to supply all grace to you so that you may have a sufficiency in all things at all times for every good deed. Now let's shorten that down. God is able to make all grace abound to you for every good deed. Which means every deed you do, relying upon grace, by faith in future grace, you're a deeper debtor. He gives you more and more and more. My bottom line is, God gets renown in the lives of His people by being the giver, not the getter. The giver gets the glory. Keep yourself in the position of a getter, not a giver. Let God always be the fountain, you be the drinker. Let God always be the bread, you be the eater. Let God always be strong, you be weak. Reason number 2, if it were possible to play the debtor's ethic, grace would no longer be grace. If you could pay him back, it'd be a financial transaction. It wouldn't be grace. It would be debt. And the third reason is because it minimizes future grace, which is what I've been trying to say. Now, there's an objection that people have raised at this point in my church when I've tried to stress this. Be a getter so that God gets the glory and you get the help. And the objection came from Psalm 116, verse 12, where it says, what shall I render to the Lord for all of His benefits to me? And they said, see, Piper, the psalmist thinks that way. He thinks in terms of render back, render back. So what are you going to make of that? What shall I render to the Lord? That's Psalm 116:12. What shall I render to the Lord for all of His benefits to me? And as with most objections, I always answer the same way. I say, read the rest of the verse or read the next verse. What's the answer to that question? Does anybody know the answer to that question? What shall I render to the Lord for all of His benefits to me? You know what the answer is? I will lift up the cup of salvation and call upon the name of the Lord. See, got something for you. He will not be pleased. He will not be pleased. He wants empty cups. I will lift up the cup of salvation and call upon the name of the Lord. Fill my cup, Lord. Prayer is the key. Prayer is the key. Psalm 50. This is Robinson Crusoe's text. You ever read Robinson Crusoe? This is the text he lived by. Charles Spurgeon preached a sermon one time called Robinson Crusoe's text, and it was Psalm 50:15. Call upon me in the day of trouble, and I will deliver you, and you will glorify me. What a deal. What a deal. We call, He comes and delivers, He gets the glory, we get the help. That's my whole theology. God gets glory by being a giver. I give Him glory by being a thankful happy, satisfied receiver that doesn't turn to idols. Oh, how eager God is to work for you, CRM. How eager He is to work for you. Let me close with a few verses to underline that. Psalm 64:4. From of old no one has heard or perceived by the ear, no one has seen a God besides you who work for those who wait for Him. Missionaries, this text says there's no God like that anywhere. Is Allah of Islam is not like that. The 700 million gods of the Hindus are not like that. Buddha is not like that. The gods in rocks and stones are not like that. Even the God of Israel, minus Jesus, is not like that. Let's read it again so you hear that. From of old, no one has heard or perceived with the ear. No eye has seen a God besides you like this. What? What is unique about our God? Who works for those who wait for Him. That's Isaiah 64:4. He gives a picture of it in Isaiah 46, 1-4, where he says, Bel, the Babylonian god, bows down. Nebo bows down. They are carried on carts. So now picture this. The gods of the nations have to be worked for. We work for our God, and we show how great He is by working for them. And so they put them on carts, and they pull the carts to get their God where they want Him to be. And you know what Isaiah puts as a contrast to that? He says, from your birth I have carried you. I will carry and will save. I will carry and redeem. To your gray hairs I am He, and there is no other. I carry and I save. You don't work for God. He works for you. Our job is to discover how to live by faith in future grace.
This is Light and Truth, God-centered preaching to help you see Christ clearly and treasure Him truly. I'm your host, Dan Kruver. Thank you for listening. On our next episode, John Piper begins a 3-part series titled Martin Luther, Man of the Book. I hope you'll join us. For more resources, visit desiringgod.org.